Today, many of us believe money is simply printed by the government. But the truth is far more surprising and honestly, a bit unsettling. In the modern world, is money actually being created? Or is what's really being created debt? At its core, the system doesn't rest on real, tangible assets as much as it rests on debt contracts and digital signatures. Banks enter into computers. When someone takes out a loan, the money doesn't come out of a bank vault. In that moment, the bank effectively creates brand new money. Yes, money that didn't exist before. It's nothing more than a number on a balance sheet, a line of entries in a system. And this creates a loop where the economy needs more and more lending. In order to keep growing, if borrowing stops, money flow stops. And when money flow stops, the system starts to collapse. That's the invisible formula behind the economic order we live in today. It's not uncontrolled money being created, it's uncontrolled debt. Money is born the moment debt is created, and it disappears the moment that debt is paid back. That's why governments, companies, and individuals are pushed to stay in debt. Because if the debt ends, the economy ends. It might sound crazy when you first hear it, but this is the reality of modern finance. Now we're going to look deeper at how this truth grew and turned into a massive system. Banks hold enormous power, but it's a power that remains largely invisible and isn't clearly recorded under any single official authority. When someone takes out a loan, the bank doesn't pay that money out of its existing cash reserves. Instead, it writes a number into the customer's account from scratch. In other words, it makes money appear to exist when it didn't before. This process can simply be called money creation, and it is entirely a digital illusion. The more loans banks issue, the more new money is created. That's why most of the money circulating in the economy today isn't physical at all. It's made up of accumulated credit and debt. But this is where the danger of the system begins. While debts grow exponentially, real production does not grow at the same pace. The digital expansion of money falls far behind real value creation. And that gap eventually comes back as inflation, financial crises, and market collapses. So banks don't actually create money in the way most people imagine. They create traces of future debt that must be repaid. As those traces grow larger, the system becomes increasingly fragile, and even the smallest pause can be enough to trigger an economic breakdown. So who actually has the power to create this money? Does the state control it? Answering simply, the government, wouldn't really be accurate. In reality, what modern states do to keep their economies running is borrow from central banks and from financial markets. As governments borrow, they issue bonds. Banks buy those bonds, and in return, new money is created once again. In other words, the economy expands not through production, but through debt. This cycle has grown so large that even entire countries are now forced to live on debt. Because if borrowing stops, growth stops. If growth stops, unemployment rises. And rising unemployment ultimately leads to social instability and breakdown. That's why no government can truly stop borrowing. States may appear to be managing debt, but in reality, they are managed by it. Today, even the world's most powerful economies carry the highest debt levels in their history, because the system itself seems to be built on borrowing. Without it, the system simply cannot function. This is the unseen will driving the modern global economy. Inflation is commonly seen as a sign that the economy is breaking down. But in reality, it functions as one of the system's most essential fuels. In a debt-driven economy, prices are expected to rise so that debts can effectively shrink in real terms. Inflation is not a mistake, contrary to popular belief. It is a pressure valve deliberately built into the system to keep it running. When governments reach a point where they struggle to repay their debts, they play their hidden card, the devaluation of the currency. By doing this, both government debt and the risk carried by banks are reduced. But in this scenario, who receives the bill? The answer is clear: the public's purchasing power. The rising cost of food, energy, and rent today is not merely a matter of supply and demand. These increases are the natural outcome of a debt-based economy. In other words, what gives birth to inflation is the system itself. As money is continuously multiplied, its value is continuously reduced in inverse proportion. And as long as this cycle remains unbroken, inflation cannot truly be stopped. The expansion of the debt system gives rise to another phenomenon: a massive economic hierarchy pyramid. At the very top sit central banks, beneath them commercial banks, below those corporations, and at the very bottom the public, often treated as the expendable layer. Debt flows downward from the top, while the cost of that debt is paid upward from the bottom. The fragility of this pyramid exposes the world to a level of risk never before seen in history. At a certain point, debt reaches a scale that can no longer be repaid. People can no longer service their loans. Companies struggle to secure financing, and governments suffocate under the weight of interest payments. In such moments, only two outcomes remain: a massive reset or a total collapse. Throughout history, every debt-based economy has met the same fate. Eventually, real value overwhelms inflated value. This is the greatest threat facing the economic future of the modern world. The system may appear enormous and powerful, but in reality, it is little more than a castle built on sand. The greatest secret of the modern economic order is this: money is not created. What is created is debt, and that debt must keep growing constantly, because the system can only survive as long as debt continues to flow. Of course, nothing can grow forever. That is why the world is slowly being pulled into an invisible collapse. Inflation, income inequality, housing crises, employment pressure, these are not separate problems. They are all side effects of the same underlying issue. So where is the path to a solution? The answer is simple, yet extremely difficult: knowledge. As long as people do not understand how the money system truly works, the system will continue to reproduce itself. Power shifts away from the public and into the hands of algorithms, banks, and global capital. Yet the true power of finance does not come from money. It comes from human awareness. At the end of this story, only one question remains: is a world built on debt sustainable? Or will humanity be forced to move forward with a completely new economic understanding? In order to save itself, share your thoughts in the comments, because this debate will shape the future of finance. What would you think if you were told that the greatest power struggle in the world is not fought with tanks but with interest rates? Central banks are the invisible commanders of modern economies. In reality, they are the true bosses of money. They set the price of money: interest. Interest rates are the pulse of an economy. When they rise, borrowing slows and investment weakens. When they fall even slightly, debt explodes, consumption surges, and markets accelerate. That is why central banks are the most critical actors in the system. But this power is not without risk, because central banks are also trying to keep a debt-based economy running. Every time they lower interest rates, people and companies borrow more, injecting new money into the system. When they raise rates, the economy hits the brakes, but debt suddenly becomes unbearable. This vicious cycle is so powerful that a single interest rate decision can change the lives of millions overnight. Housing prices skyrocketing in one country, inflation exploding in another, or unemployment rising elsewhere is often caused by a single shot: interest rates. In other words, central banks do not just manage money. They shape human behavior, steer economies, and even influence the fate of nations. This game is silent, but its consequences determine the course of history. The heart of the debt system beats right here, and however fast or slow that heart beats, the global economy either breathes easily or begins to choke. Today, the global economy is covered by a massive shadow of debt. As this shadow spreads, countries become more fragile and vulnerable. So what happens if the system one day comes to a halt? When debt creation slows down, the flow of money also stops. When money stops flowing, consumption collapses. Companies shrink, unemployment explodes, and the entire economy begins to fall like a line of dominoes. This is the hidden mechanism behind economic crises. 2008, 1998, 1929, every one of them traces back to the same source: excessive borrowing followed by a sudden slowdown. Today, total global debt is dozens of times larger than total global income. This alone shows that the system is mathematically unsustainable. But the real chapter of this story begins here. Because throughout history, humanity has found a way forward in every crisis, and it may do so again. The solution is not printing more money, nor creating even more debt. The solution is to redesign finance not as a tool of power, but as a tool for society. Without transparency, without financial literacy, and in a world where people do not understand the system, the outcome always remains the same: a few winners and many losers. However, when people truly understand how the system works, power over money begins to shift hands. Perhaps in the future, a more just and sustainable financial system can be built. Perhaps digital currency technologies will fundamentally change this order. Or perhaps an entirely new economic understanding will emerge. In the end, the real question is this: when this debt-driven system eventually collapses, what do you think will replace it? And how will order continue? Share your thoughts in the comments, because the silent majority, you, will be the ones who shape the future.